Let's start now. My name is Kalpesh Shah, and on behalf of the MIT CIO Symposium the Organizing Committee, I would like to welcome you to all How Big Companies Are Running Smarter panel. It's my great privilege to introduce Dr. Neil Thompson, who is MIT's CSAIL research scientist, as well as Harvard's Innovation Lab visiting professor. And it's my great privilege to welcome you, Dr. Thompson. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Welcome. So before we get going today, I want to start by just giving a little bit of background here, because we're going to be talking about how companies can run smarter. And the particular lens we're going to take on that is looking at how companies are innovating. And I think we all hear all of the time this idea of like companies are having to run faster, there's more disruptive innovation. And so in our discussion, we're going to talk about a lot of those issues. And I want to start us off with just a little bit of data to actually motivate this. Oh. Oh. Nope.
Maybe not.
Maybe not, okay.
Yep. Oh, wait, now. Okay, wait. All right, we have it. Okay, so I just want to start out by saying, like, actually, wait a minute, no, but we jumped ahead. All right. Okay. All right, let's try this one. Nope.
Okay.
Just a little bit of a delay.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a slide with a bunch of line graphs. All right, while we are trying to sort that out, let me give a little bit more background here. So it should be preceding this. It should say the pace of innovation. Oh, earlier?
That's okay.
Sorry, I don't have that
Slide.
slide. I just haven't typed it.
All right.
We looked at it just a moment ago. Okay, all right. We are going to wing this. That's fine. Okay, so there's a question of if we are we indeed in this world where actually companies need to run faster? Or is there some data that supports that? And it turns out actually the answer is yes. And so if you do things like if you look at the S&P 500 list, okay, you can ask, like, how long has a firm been on that list? And it turns out that a few decades ago, well, actually, like 3 or 4 decades ago, the answer might have been you might have been on that list for like 50 years, right? The average tenure of people who are on that list. Today it's maybe a third that, right? There has been this secular decrease over time of less and less tenure for the people who are on the S&P 500. That's also true if you look at the companies with the most revenue in the United States. You see that the lists that make that top 500 also going down over time, right? So, okay, so that actually seems to give us some sense of maybe something is going on, that actually firms really are, either because of the competition they're doing or because the sectors they're in are being eclipsed by other firms. And that suggests that firms might need to do something a little bit differently. Okay, and so that's what we're really going to talk about today, is in terms of, if innovation is a way to do that, what might you do? All right, so, no.
One moment, I'm going to switch to a backup.
Okay. Okay, so let's start out why we will do the data second, and we'll start out by just talking a little bit about this idea of actually how are firms sourcing innovation, right? So I think all of us recognize that for a long time there has been this view of sort of, well, not made here, right? And then people resisting that. But we actually now see lots of evidence that firms are doing much more open innovation. Oh. Okay, yes. Okay, so this is what I was saying about the S&P 500. Okay, so here you can see the average tenure for companies that are on the S&P 500. And you can see that in 1960, it was about 60 years. And by 2010, we're down to about 20 years. Okay, this very large decrease. You can also see this in terms of revenue by the Fortune 500. So if you look at attrition. So here what we're looking at is, when a list is first published, obviously all 500 are on that list. And then as years go by, fewer and fewer firms that were on that list remain on the list. But look, this line that I've shown you is the 1955 list. Now look what happens if you go to 1965. OK, it's kind of falling off at about the same rate. 1975, faster. 1995, quite a bit faster. OK, so you really do see this acceleration happening in firms being replaced, either in terms of the total market capitalization they have or in terms of the firms with the biggest revenue. OK. All right, so now let's talk about actually sourcing innovation and how you might actually go and get that innovation that's going to help you run faster. So let me just start by saying, what can some survey data tell us? So along with some co-authors, I ran a survey where we looked at 320 big firms around the world. So they had at least 500 million US in revenue. And we said, OK, which actual innovation sources are you using? And you can see, interestingly, that suppliers is the greatest at about 85%, and central R&D at 77%. And as we go down, you can see people like us, universities, are on here. Then you have your business unit staff. So this is like not being run centrally, but being run within a business unit. And we're going to divide that up into two groups. So we have these dedicated folks and these operational folks. So the dedicated folks are the ones who are, like, you're located in the business unit, but 100% of your time, you are actually doing innovation, right? The operational staff is like the Google 20% time, right? It's, you have a day job, but on the side, we'll give you a little bit of time, and maybe you can do some innovation there. You see that is actually used much, much less than dedicated folks. Third party, that's like consultants and people like that. Customers or user innovation here. And then you can see a number of these areas where people are talking a lot about, like startups. About a third of firms are using startups as a source of innovation, and about 20% are using crowd. OK, so that gives you just sort of a starting sense of, OK, people are using a pretty wide variety of them. We can also look at how long they've been using these sources. OK, and here I want to actually start at the right-hand side here with the crowd. OK, so here we've divided the 100% of people who use crowd into people who've only been using it for 0 to 2 years, for 3 to 5 years, or for more than 5 years. Basically, nobody has been using crowd for more than 5 years. OK, so even though we've been talking about it for quite a while, it is only really in these last 5 years that you see this wholesale move to it. Similarly with startups, right? Actually, more than 90% of the firms that are now using startups were not using them 5 years ago. OK? Interestingly, even universities, which we like to think we've been helping people for a long time, right? Actually, many of the people using it have only been using it pretty recently. So this is this very interesting trend, particularly on the right-hand side here, of a number of these innovation sources. There's a large-scale movement of people into it. Clarifying question?
Would you attribute that perhaps to a changing definition of innovation, what that innovation means?
Well, you know what? I'm going to hold that question, and we'll let our panelists opine on that idea. OK, and then lastly, just I've shown you what people are using. Let's also ask about what's important. OK, and so we asked these firms which of these innovation sources is the most important. And not surprisingly, people still said, even though I'm using a whole bunch, right? My central R&D lab, that's the most important. For 56% of the firms, that's the most important source they use. But innovation labs, which are quite new, already 13% of companies said that that's the most important. And here by an innovation lab, the difference we mean is like you co-locate that with somebody like in Cambridge or in Silicon Valley, like you have a specific technology that you're trying to draw out. That's what the innovation labs are here. And then you see these other internal sources, the business unit staff, and then you see some of these other ones. Now, we asked this question, though, in two ways, and the difference is interesting. So this was what we said, to your company, what's the most important? We also asked them, OK, what's the most successful innovation project you've had over the last few years? Tell me which source you used for that. OK, so at the project level, and here we see a different pattern. Right? So these innovation labs, only 13% of the firms, that was the most important source. But for 25% of the firms, their most successful innovation had come from an innovation lab. Similarly, universities, right? Only 2% is saying it's the most important, but 9% of the most important innovations are coming from there. Okay, so there's very interesting patterns we're seeing of people moving into different innovation sources, people getting really important projects to their firms coming out of it. And the question is sort of, well, what should we do with these things, right? What should we think about these as a community that is trying to understand how these businesses are evolving? And so we're very lucky today to have 3 panelists who are going to help us answer these questions. So what I'm going to do is I'll ask each of you a question, and if you will start by sort of introducing yourself and giving a little bit of background, and then we'll get into this. So I already mentioned this idea that many firms have started with thinking, okay, not made here, we're not really interested in that. But as we can see, firms are now starting to embrace these things. Can you talk about some of the growing pains that firms are going through as they're trying to match some project they have in mind with some innovation source that they're thinking of using for it?
Sure. You want me to start?
Please.
All right. Brian Vellmure, I'm with Salesforce, Senior Director of Strategy and Innovation. I think the comment that the gentleman in the back raised is an interesting one. Like, what is innovation, right? There's many different types of innovation: product innovation, service innovation, experience innovation. And so I think it's important to understand what context we're talking about. I'm part of a team that was an experiment, and I guess it was an innovation of Salesforce, started about 5 or 6 years ago, where we noticed that we certainly were looked to as a leader in CRM. Many of you know us as that, sales, marketing, service, right? And so there were many conversations that our CEO, Mark, would have with customers. And all of a sudden, the tone of those conversations shifted a little bit to less about CRM or less about technology, but more around the idea of our industry is getting disrupted. Like, our shelf time of a model or something that works is shrinking for our company. Seems like you guys are at the forefront, just as a company, of aligning with this disruptive change. What are you doing, and can you help us? And as those ramped up, Mark thought, maybe I should start a team that helps to have this level of conversation with senior leaders from our customers. And so the work that we do is generally at the C-level. It's focused around a big idea or a vision that most of the C-suite would sort of say, yeah, that's what we're doing. But if you double-clicked on it and asked them, what exactly does that mean? You get a wide variance of answers and how they might do it. And so the question, I think, Neil, that you asked is, what are companies struggling with? I think it's a lot of things. In our work, what we see is there's kind of a few basic steps. One is there's lots of ideas, right, from lots of owners of a department or a division, right? There's no shortage of ideas. That's not the challenge. The challenge is driving consensus amongst multiple functions or business units initially around what is the shared vision of what we're doing. And that traditionally, if we go back in time 10 or 15 years ago, that happened in conference rooms or boardrooms, and it was effective enough because if it took you a year or two to gain alignment, that was okay because you had 10 or 20-year horizon. In this case, things are moving so fast, you actually have to come to consensus very, very quick. So the very first thing that we do as part of our process is, number one, make sure that there's executive alignment, and then number two, begin to socialize that. Only because we've observed that in order to execute against some innovation project, if you don't have alignment and clarity around what you're doing, where you're going, and who's doing what, you're kind of dead from the very, very start, right? And so we address that. There's other steps to our process, but I'll be quiet now and turn it over to
Okay.
the other panel.
Yeah, so let's turn to Aarti. So Aarti, can you talk to us a little bit about sort of the push and pull of when you're trying to decide, do you want to innovate sort of within the firm or outside the firm? What are those different forces that are pulling on that decision?
Sure. So thanks, Neil. So I'm Aarti Shah. Good afternoon. I'm the Chief Information and Digital Officer for Lilly. I've been there for 25 years and have been blessed with a variety of different opportunities over these 25 years, functional role, business role, and then recently in the last 3 years coming into this role. So on this topic of innovation, so first and foremost, right, so for a pharma company means our basic strategy is, for Lilly, is an innovation-based strategy. So we are not talking today about, right, so molecule, you can think about molecule innovation, and yes, there's a whole business development strategy, and we want to make sure that there's innovation that happens through our labs, but there are innovations that happens externally. And when we need to get new modalities, new technologies, all that stuff, that's a whole different kind of acquisition that actually complements what we have to even make it better, okay? Innovation, basic definition, and I always believe that it happens at the cross-section of different disciplines. So you need that diversity of thought, experiences, all that stuff coming together for innovation to really grow. And that's why your slide, whether you do this inside, outside, I don't think of any project right now where we don't have multiple collaborations happening, whether it's with academia, other biotech, startups, our key suppliers. So it's a variety of that. The models, right? So if it's not made here, and we have tried a couple of them, there are these tensions, and I believe that you have to incorporate other parameters like what is the culture of the company, right? So a 140-year-old company, we have been doing very successfully drug development for so many years. So one of the things of all the different learnings we have had, Neil, at least as we embark on our digital health strategy, one of the models we are looking at, or we are actually working on, is a little bit what you call the push and pull model. And what I mean by that is, yes, we need a group that's focused on saying, bring the outside in, what's happening in the world of digital therapeutics, this world of RX plus DX, where we have our medicines, and whether it's products and all the services surrounding our medicines. What does that future look like? But then the business has the deep knowledge of what that patient journey is. What are the barriers for that patient getting the medication, all that stuff? So how do we create that push and pull model? And we do it, we have, of course, the roles and responsibilities, but we do it through what we call big use cases. And we involve the business. There's the core, the center, if you call the center of excellence, or the function. And then as we move towards this, all the other functions like quality, regulatory, legal, that has to come together. So we do it through the use cases, make them part of the, if you're going through a design thinking kind of experience, make them part of that through. So we can do that bunch of prototyping, thinking, and all that stuff. And then when it gets to scale, they need to push it and pull it all the way through with their marketing and all that stuff.
So can you maybe give us an example so that people can understand sort of concretely what these different players are bringing to these roles? Like, is there, as something has gone through this process, what does that look like?
So what different people are bringing to the table is really the different experiences and the different mindset. Right? So you need that entrepreneur kind of mindset and things like that that are coming through versus our traditional methods. I can kind of say, let's think about in research specifically. We are kind of working through and saying traditional ways, and how do you discover medicines faster? How do you decrease the time from when a target is identified to first in human? And within our ecosystem, within Lilly Research Labs, we are creating smaller, nimble teams. They have a very different decision-making power, and we are putting different boards within the company for those teams to say, okay, go as fast as the science goes, allows you to take you. And those are some of the things we are bringing in together. That's one example. There are many, and I can talk about every phase of development, and we'll get into some of the conversations. We have big transformations that are going on in very innovative ways of how we are looking at that, and then how does technology enable that? How does data analytics enable those transformations to move faster? How do we get medicines to the patients better, faster, cheaper at the end of the day to get better outcomes?
Okay. That's great. And it's very interesting because as part of the survey work that we did, we talked to a lot of people, and we started hearing more and more this idea of people putting together sort of a special governing body for things that they want to move fast, because they just found that it was like, if there was someone way over there in legal, if something else was on their plate, then it could wait, their project could get stalled for 2 months while they're waiting for something, and it just had to be somebody who owned it and could move very quickly on it.
So we kind of call, your data has to be on demand, governance has to be on demand too, right? So it's on demand.
Exactly. Okay, so let me turn to Doug, and I want to ask about this question of, as we have these different innovation sources, you sort of end up building up this idea that you have an ecosystem where it's like, you're working with universities with something, as Aarti was saying, but then maybe you're working with somebody else on, a related topic and stuff. How do you manage this type of an ecosystem where you have lots of people feeding into the company?
Sure. So Doug Palmer, I'm a principal at Deloitte Consulting, and my day job is advising clients on digital business and digital transformation. My hobby over the past 8 years has been working with Sloan Management Review on the topic of digital business and looking at how companies become more digitally mature. And in that process, we've surveyed probably over 30,000 people, 125 interviews, and the concept of what's a digitally mature organization is something we've looked hard at. And what we find is maybe about 25 to 30% are in the early stage, companies that haven't quite started thinking about it. If you look at kind of Jeannie's view up this morning, that they're kind of not there yet, they're thinking about digitization. Then you have this group in the middle that are developing, and then we'll have this group that we'll call maturing. And we use maturing because you're never actually done given the pace of change. And what we've tried to do is break down what's different about those maturing companies. And it turns out innovation is one of those key themes, right? The things that they're doing to work across boundaries, the money and the focus that they're putting in. So you talked about Google time. Are they dedicating 10 or 20% of their time to think differently as they go through it? Another piece of that becomes the experimentation. I think Jeannie used the word failure, and that failure wasn't necessarily good, but the ability to experiment and learn. And then what we found was the ones that struggled were the ones that couldn't scale fast enough, right? So if you're looking at a drug trial and something's working, how do you put the right money into it? And in some cases, we saw companies, large hospitality companies, that had to make do within, right? So they had to create efficiencies out of operating budgets in order to scale that, right? So I think there's something that's super important there, that it's almost an 8x difference in innovation between the mature and the early stage. Now, if I take a look at the work that we do for clients, one of the things that we've built is an ecosystems and alliance organization. And what we do is we use that as technology scanning. And we partner with companies like Salesforce, and we help companies like Lilly bring that together. But you also look at what are they doing in IoT? What is happening in AR, VR? How are you going to bring these things together that you have to be connected into the startups, to the universities, so that you can start to do that experimentation, either internal to the company or in partnership. And I think that's probably one of the things to explore, to say, how's that okay to do, and how do you set time aside to make that work?
And actually, Doug, if I can just add, that last piece also helps so that you don't have everybody trying to scout the market, right? What's happening and running after the most shiny object and all that stuff. At least this way you have a group that's dedicated. What's happening outside brings that outside in perspective, brings that while we are delivering for the business today and preparing for that future.
Yep.
And so what do you see, Doug, when you like, for example, maybe you have one person in your organization who's scouting universities, and they're saying, hey, there's this lab over here, they're doing something really cool, that's a tenure away thing. And someone else is saying, well, actually, we want to be working with this startup on sort of the same issue. Their sort of reach is not as great, but they might actually be available 2 years from now, not 10 years from now. Like, how do you start managing that thing of like, well, do I want to start working with this person and then transition over? Do I have to start, like, how are firms actually managing that?
I think there's two pieces of that. The first one, if you think about the 10-year cycle and you talk about how quick people disappear, John Hagel, who's one of my colleagues at the Center for Edge Innovation, will talk about zoom in and zoom out. And he'll talk about companies need to look out there 10 years to look at things like the sharing economy and the impact that's going to have on your business. But you need to focus on the here and now. What can you do in 12 or 18 months in terms of investments? So I think the investments that either we would make or a company like Lilly would make in a university would to be on the cutting edge. But then what I would do in terms of the ecosystem partnerships is I'd start to bring people in early stage, and I'd start to try to apply that to an actual business problem. So we'd be experimenting with that. And then ones that work, you move faster, right? And in our alliance world, we'll actually talk about dating at first, right? So before you form that alliance relationship, you want to actually try it a couple times. You want to see if it works, if there's a good relationship, and there's a compatible culture and technology view. And if it works, then you scale it. So it'd be the same sort of approach that you have to have enough of a filter to know what's good. And then once you find those 2 or 3, how do you actually then drive those into the marketplace?
Yeah. So, Aarti, let me come back to you for a second. So, as we build up these ecosystems, we have this problem, which is we're using a whole bunch of different sources, and at some point you have to evaluate them, right? If you're doing that testing process, and you have to measure things, right? And, of course, there's the old adage, you can't manage what you can't measure, but, innovation is notoriously hard to measure. So how is Lilly trying to tackle some of those issues?
Yeah, no, it's a very important question. Means at the end of the day, right, we have to connect it to business results. Otherwise, it's nothing. So for example, at Lilly, right, so means at the end of the day, what are we trying to do? Means, of course, the purpose is very noble, right? Lilly unites caring with discovery to make medicines, to help people around the world. At the end of the day, it's to get that better outcome, the best outcome, therapeutic outcome for that patient. And if you think about traditionally how we all consume medicines, right, we pay for the product unit prices, and more where the future is going is what I would call outcomes-based. Pay for performance, and it should be like that. So when I look at the broader piece of it, right, so at Lilly means if you look at the drug discovery process, it takes over 10 plus years to bring a molecule, make it to a medicine and launch that, right, 10 plus. And in my 25 years, I know the statistics from IMS have gone from 800 million to 1.6 to over 2 billion. To get that medicine, all that stuff it takes. So then the question is, okay, you are trying to, in every phase of drug development, you want to shorten the timelines to drug discovery and development, right? Whether it's your productivity piece, whether it's manufacturing it in, faster, or connecting with the patient in a different way, with the HCP, the healthcare provider in a different way. All of that has to end to better outcome for the patient, because once you have better outcome patients, you can then work with the payers and all that stuff to get the value for that. And we are kind of working through value-based agreements. I think Lilly did its first value-based agreement, I think in 2014. We have several.
Do you want to say a little bit more about how that works?
So the value-based agreements means there's a set of parameters that you would say that, you know, you as a patient means if you achieve this therapeutic efficacy and experience all that stuff, that's where the cost and all that stuff comes into play. But I would say that whole system, ecosystem within the United States, the healthcare system has to work in that fashion for more of us to go into that way, to move for pay for performance kind of idea.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I want to turn back now to a few more slides, because we've heard a number of people say, or our panelists say, okay, you know, we're having to make these big things. People are trying to move quickly because they want to disrupt. And so I want to sort of turn to this idea of transformational innovation, right? And this may be something that people have often heard about as like Horizon 1, 2, and 3, or, you know, as it's kind of like incremental innovation at one end and sort of transformational innovation at the other end. And there are about 17 different names for the middle category. But, you know, the idea here is an incremental innovation might be if you go from an iPhone 6 to an iPhone 7, it's not that big a change, right? Most of the things are kind of the same. A more substantial one might be if you go to a touch screen from one with buttons, right? You can do some new things. And transformational might be more like you know, a landline to actually a cell phone, right? That's a pretty big gap. Now, what I think is interesting is if you think that you're always being disrupted, right? People often say, well, let's try and figure out how we can disrupt ourselves and get to that business model first. So one of the things we ask firms is just, of the money that you're actually spending on innovation, how much of that investment is going to these three different areas? Okay, so here I'm just going to show you the distribution of firms at incremental, substantial, and transformational. So here, but first, is what was recommended. So this is back in 2012. There's a Nagy and Tuff article in the Harvard Business Review that said firms should really strive to be able to get up to 10% and 20% in this, and then the rest would be incremental. Look where we are today, right? Almost all of the firms that we surveyed are spending well more than this on transformational, well more than this on substantial, and they're already quite a bit below on incremental. Firms are making this very deliberate push to do bigger size innovation. Okay, so this seems like it could be a challenge for a CIO. So can you take us through, Brian, what is that actually going to look like in terms of changing the role of a CIO if suddenly you're trying to take these big inventive steps?
Yeah, first of all, I think the data is fascinating because anecdotally, what we see with large, would you mind putting it back up? What we see with the large enterprises, and this is again not scientific, but I would say most of the companies, say an N of 10 to 15 or 20, 90% unfortunately is being spent on incremental or erasing tech debt, right? And maybe 5 to 10 is in the transformational, and maybe 5 to 10 gets in the substantial. Like our observation is that there's fixing all the long list of stuff in technical debt that we just have to improve that we know we need to do. We are betting and investing in innovation labs and trying to do some disruptive stuff on the edge and seed and grow. And all this stuff in the middle, it's like, man, I don't know how to reconcile both of those is one of the biggest challenges we see.
Well, maybe to build off that, Brian, and if you look at this, it looks like a technology investment. But a couple of things we haven't talked about that we had a prep call and we just kind of kept going on this. One is strategy, not technology, actually drives transformation. We've seen that in the data, that if you don't have a strategy, it doesn't matter how much money you spend on technology. How many people in this room think they have enough digital or technology leaders in their organization? Raise your hand if you think you've got all the leaders you need, right? How many people think they have enough digital workers or people with the right skill set to drive this, right? That's the key issue. And we'll talk about culture in a second. But we've seen a have and have not and the rich get richer. So the people that are on that maturing side are more likely to poach your people, to pull people in and make stuff happen. The people on that early side fall further behind every year. So it is a little bit of an arms race as you go through it. But when you look at that, if you're not talking about what you're doing to build the strategy, to build the people, either the leaders or the workforce, because your last panel we were talking about how do you build and how do you train and how do you learn, that's actually the key part of what's going to make this work.
Yeah. Neil, I'm going to say that, you said it is a challenge to the CIOs. It's this humongous opportunities to actually lean in and step and be that CIO plus, right? To create and lead your companies to that value. Incrementally, yes, you have to find ways to self-fund it. For companies that have a lot of legacy, all that stuff, there is a lot of stuff in there that you can make it run more efficiently, and you have to be able to find self-funded. If another business unit gets that kind of budget stuff, you should also be given that same stuff and be able to self-fund it. I think on the transformation and substantial, you have humongous opportunities to kind of lead the organizations and bring to that, integrate their strategies and have that integrated IT and business strategy to eventually deliver on that business result. So this is most exciting, and I know 3 years ago when I came into this role, coming from outside of tech and IT, I had that comment that, how can somebody from outside of IT be more excited about IT? Now nobody asks me that, the whole group is excited, but I see significant opportunities for us to step in and lead our organizations through this digital and cognitive era.
And how do you find that process where you're sort of, you say, like, you come in and you want to take this leadership role and you're saying, like, I want to transform the business, right? Traditionally businesses are reticent of...
But it's not I, it's the we. It's I and the business partner. The business and IT are not separate. And I think once you have built that trusted relationships, the networks, the credibility is there. And it's so very important that we understand the business we are trying to transform. We can speak that language. We are very clear in terms of the value it will deliver, and we have to be put to test on the same stuff that, yes, at the end of the day, can I bring in the business value, right, that the company needs?
Just to build on what Doug was saying, we work with a lot of the high-tech providers that understand by the DNA of their model and the people that they have how a digital, flywheel, where we're instrumenting our entire organization to capture data, we're applying algorithms to make sense of that data, we're making better decisions because of that, and then the flywheel keeps spinning around. Like, that's their whole organization. And then we walk into, a traditional organization that's been around for 150 years. It's not you guys, but 150 years. And they've got, 18 people in the organization that think that way. So there is a huge element here. And actually, in some of our best projects where we've built consensus, they have a shared vision, they've mobilized, they've begun to execute successfully. They're running on our platform not only, but also the overall IT platform. And then they come back to us a few months later going like, everything you guys have done have been incredible, like off the charts. Our problem is we've got 60,000 people spread around the globe, and 59,800 of them don't get it, and we don't have a way. Like, they were hired 10 or 15 years ago for a different purpose, and so how do we solve that? And quite candidly, we don't exactly know how to solve that right now, but I think it's collectively all of us beginning to instrument some sort of rapid learning and evaluation plan.
Yeah, I would agree
that goes deeply
wholeheartedly
into
that it's not for the faint of heart, okay? It is hard. It is hard, but the alignment from the top has to be there. The support, the sponsorship from the executives has to be there. And then the power of storytelling. So we went through a big transformation, especially where we called it next generation development, where we had to, we put a very audacious goal out there to reduce the drug development cycle time by half, okay? It is huge. Now it's a journey, but we have reduced it by 2 years on an average. And what it took, but the power of storytelling as we went through the success stories, and people were naysayers, laughed at it, but then they started believing in it. Of course, it went in a very structured way, but once we were able to share more and more examples with the company, with more employees, people bought in, and now it's getting there.
The culture piece of this can't be understated.
Yeah.
We're doing work for a global nonprofit where the CEO saw that he had to change the business model because they wouldn't be around in 5 or 10 years just because of the nature of donating had shifted. He brought a chief digital officer in from outside that knew the technology, knew the platforms, but didn't know the organization. So it turned out the CEO had to move around with this chief digital officer in order to do the translation, in order to get the alignment and the buy-in, because it was breaking down the existing business units and the power bases into something very different. Because it wasn't going to be regionally or geographically centered. It was going to be maybe US and world. And that took a lot of work. The platform stuff was the easy part. It was the buy-in of all the executives that stood to lose. So as you look at your innovation and transformation efforts, that becomes a really big piece to say, who are the folks who are going to bring it along? And I think storytelling is the piece that actually helps people get it. Or in the case of the labs that Brian and his team run, they actually give you a visual artifact that you can take back that says, this is what my business model is going to look like, or here's how I'm going to operate, or here's what the customer experience will look like. That then becomes the way that the conversation happens within the building.
We're talking about, it's hard. The stuff that we're talking about is really, really hard for a lot of reasons. I mean, you're talking about most companies used to provide a product or a portfolio of products or a portfolio of services, and that's what they did. And they were centered on a product or a service, and they just did that better and better and better, and they went to market in that way. And now everybody's being faced with culture, I need to change it, sustainability, are we moving from serving our shareholders to this wide set of stakeholders, and how much should I be allocating there? Like for senior leadership, they're trying to wrestle through all of these questions. How many of you actually, like as one of your company's strategic objectives, now has culture or sustainability or both as like one of the 4 or 5 pillars that, and that's probably, it's either new or it's moved up the priority list. It's now gone from, this is important.
If you guys read the note, State Street published something that said they sent something to all their board of directors of their invested companies saying, we're going to hold you accountable for telling us what your culture plan is in support of your strategy, and we want to be able to get answers for that this year. Being raised for them.
When you have BlackRock, right, who is considered the epicenter of capitalism, talking about sustainability, right, and stakeholder, that puts tremendous pressure on every part of the model and every function. I think it leaves all of us asking the questions: what does this mean for me, and how do we align? And that's where I think the culture piece fits in, and it actually boils down to stripping away just some of the orthodoxies in the way things have been for quite a long time. And it does take, going back to your original slide, Neil, and I already said it, this internal versus external, I think we don't have time to choose, right? Because all the information is on the edges of our ecosystems, and we have to get all the information together and make sense of it together so we can move together.
A best practice around that we've seen is we talked about the collaboration, but it's got to be cross silos. If you go back to your internal R&D unit, if it's just them not connected into the business units, and the interesting part is they're actually allowing those teams to work together, and they're goaling and they're recognizing / rewarding those teams collectively, not individually. And we've seen that repeated time and time again in the digitally mature organizations as you think about how you work across those boundaries. And then it becomes, as Jeannie was saying this morning, there isn't that tight hierarchy, that there's autonomy, and that you look for those smart employees that are thinking about these thoughts. That's not necessarily CEO or C-suite or board driven, but then it's accelerated by the support from the leadership.
And I think this is such an interesting point, because this idea of you have to scan, I think the area where we see that most is in digital technologies, right? That's something we've come across. And so that's actually what I want to turn to for our last of the sort of 3 topics we're going to talk about today. Because one of the things we asked firms was we said, okay, tell us about an innovation project that you're doing. So, they told us a bunch of innovation sources they were using. We said, okay, tell us about a project that you're doing it. So maybe you're working with startups, great, tell us about a project. And then we said, is that project digital? And 82% of the projects, when we just gave them a random source, they were saying that was digital. And we were like, that was kind of overwhelming, because we're talking to, pharma companies and manufacturing companies and automobile companies, and that's a pretty high number. But the really startling one was we said, okay, tell us again about your most successful innovation. Was that digital? And the answer was 95% of projects across all of these firms, the most important project they've done in innovation in the last few years was a digital one. And just to let you know, this is true across basically every industry. So the lowest industry is pharma, and it's still 90% of the projects are digital, right? So there's this very, very large push that people are doing into digital that they feel like is making a big difference in their business. And that's translating into what they're actually doing. So if you think about actually how much they're investing, so we said, compared to 5 years ago, how much investment in digital innovation are you doing today? And the answer is, not surprisingly, basically nobody's doing less, right? Most people are doing more and a lot more. Okay, that's, maybe that's a bit of a gimme question. People are like, yeah, of course I'm investing more. But you actually can see real differences in, so we actually asked them as well about, let's see, there we go. The revenue that they had in 2007, the percentage of the revenue that they had gotten from new products that had been released since 2015. And notice the same firms here that said a lot more, of those 10% that said a lot more, 52% of them were getting at least 26% of their revenues from very new products, right? Whereas if you were only investing a little bit more, you were only 14% of firms were getting that. Right, so there's this correlation between if you are investing quite a bit more in digital innovation, you see that the new products that you're releasing make up a bigger part of the new revenue that your firm is going through. So let me throw this then to all three of you. This idea of, in the last sort of 10 years, we've seen all of these waves of machine learning and IoT and these things coming in. How do you think about digital innovation being different from what came before it?
Means one glaring difference is the speed, right, of digital innovation and the cycle time. So if you think about the cycle times that we are used to, and now we are bringing digital therapeutics, digital solutions, whatever the companion would be, right? That cycle time in terms of incubation, testing, all that stuff is much faster. It's different than doing a launch once versus as we move into the future with RX plus DX, you may, the concept of minimal viable product, right, means that is something novel, new. Until all I's and T's are crossed, everything is done. We don't launch, right? But now we are talking about a release 1, release 2, right? And that brings a whole different machinery that needs to be there across the enterprise and across all functions. It's a very different mindset. It's a very different kind of thinking. It's a very different kind of portfolio management, financial management, all of that stuff.
I think that concept of MVP, 2 years ago, you very seldom heard that being talked about in client spaces, and now that is the norm. The other piece, as we look at cross-connecting research data, this would kind of imply the rich get richer, right? Because those that are investing more are actually doing better, and then changing the slope of the, the Fortune 100 or the, falling off that top list. So it's interesting that that energy gets applied that way.
I might be so bold to maybe even reframe the question a little bit. I think our perspective would be if we're solving for customer needs, and Aarti, you talked about it, right? You talked about how do we actually develop, right, a medicine that serves the need of a particular cohort of individuals, and how do we do that faster? If we're solving the needs, and if you go to a different industry, go to retail or consumer goods, for instance. Most of the growth right now, you would say, is in e-commerce, or it's from these smaller brands that are more in touch with the values that are emerging in society. And you could say, well, all the growth is in e-commerce, like invest in digital, invest in e-commerce. I would actually argue that the growth is in solving customer jobs in the context of what they're doing. E-commerce just happens to be solving that better right now with what's available. And so I would say like this bifurcation of digital versus not digital, it might be a false bifurcation, right? It might be, we've got a suite of capabilities that some live mostly in the physical world, some live in the digital and actually emerging right now, or some are in the virtual world. Like if we're solving for human needs primarily, we have all of these capabilities that we might construct and put together in order to solve those needs, and that's where the real value might come from.
And so how, certainly when I talked with firms, often they're saying, they really, I think, completely buy into this idea of capabilities as sort of the fundamental thing, but then often the next thing is, and by the way, I might know machine learning is going to be incredibly important, but I don't have those capabilities internally. So I want to get the panel's thoughts on like how do we do that capabilities. Let me just also say to the audience, after this we're going to move to questions. So if you're on the Slido, you want to ask some questions, put that in now, and we'll get to that right after the answer. So yes, how do we think about these capabilities?
Yeah, I guess there's two pieces. On the human experience piece, I guess we haven't talked about it, but we talk about customer experience a lot. But the employee experience and the business partner experience, especially in the B2B world, all kind of make that up. And so that ends up being, I think, a big component part. What we've seen in terms of when new technology enters, that we saw a very definitive model in the 5 years of research that we did, that it usually started by you outsourced it. You either hired contractors and consultants to come in. Second phase was you hired leaders, a lot of passive recruiting, grabbing talent from other places. And then you started to build your workforce. We saw it as a very definitive piece, so that someone may not have an analytics shop. They'll bring 4 or 5 people in, they'll get smart, and then they'll go source it. And then they'll decide whether you're going to have it in-house and you need 100 people to do the analytics for the medicines and the new drugs, or whether you can buy that as a resource and then use it as you need it. So I think there's some definitive models. It'll be interesting to see how you.
Yeah, so I kind of say my short answer is you have to do all of the above. You have to build, you have to buy, you have to collaborate, and you have to teach, right? All of the above is important, especially as we think about AI and ML, right? Means that whether it's the hype or not. Now I'm dating myself, at least when I was in grad school going through my PhD in stats. Back then it was all neural nets. It was all part of this, right? I'm a firm believer that you have to have built a core expertise within your own organization. And the reason is the following, okay? And I hope I don't offend anyone, but not an hour or a day goes by where somebody is touting that they have the best AI ML stack, their analytics stack is the best, their tech stack is the best, all that stuff. And fundamentally, you have to ask the questions, all these algorithms that are being trained, the basic questions. What is the training data set? What are you training them on? And when you start pulling those threads, so it's the basic questions, otherwise it becomes a black box, and you may deploy something, and you're making literally tens of millions of dollars of decisions based on that, and it can come out completely negative. So I firmly believe we have a very, very strong advanced analytics and data sciences group. Means, great kudos to the company where it's a area of expertise and competency that we are continuing to build. Every pharma, right, is big into clinical statistics because on clinical development, but now you're seeing the expansion into advanced analytics and data sciences for these reasons that, okay, we need people who are experts. You need to bring the T back in IT. That's what I call the technology, right? The deep, it's a technical function. You need the deep data scientists and your mathematicians, their modelers, the statisticians, and then the business people to kind of confront this. Make sense?
I guess taking a slightly different approach, I think the fundamental question is, what's the level of tolerance from the executive team and the board to reinvent, right? Like how far out on the continuum am I willing to bet, and where am I going to place those bets? And then accordingly, then the subsequent decisions are, what new capabilities am I going to invest in-house or through partnership? And I think the one thing that comes to mind is, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, everybody was saying big data, big data, big data, like huge investment in big data. And then a lot of firms realized, what do I do with all this data, right? I mean, they didn't understand what they were going to do. They just had a hypothesis that we just need to get the data and the patterns will emerge automatically and that'll tell us what to do. And then a lot of money was spent, a lot of money was wasted just trying to build those capabilities. And then at some point, we've now reached, I think, a more intelligent level of maturity in understanding where we should allocate, what we should solve for. How do we define what we're solving for and right size the investment for those capabilities?
Means the other thing, you just sparked another thing, means what we are looking at is how do you co-create and co-develop with a partner, right? A tech partner who has that level of expertise and all that stuff to say, here are the problems and how do we co-create to solve this problem, which is also equally important. And if you go back, I just want to go back that innovation happens at that cross-section of different disciplines. You need to have the diversity of disciplines, the thinking, the experience, and it's not only your traditional way, in the past it would be the mathematicians or statisticians doing their job, but we are going in and saying, okay, we need the behavioral scientist, we need actual scientists, we need that diversity of disciplines coming in to think this differently, because at the end of the day, we are trying to change a behavior of the customer, of the patient, to get to that better adherence that could lead to better outcomes, right? So you can never, ever forget what that end state. So I always will come back. Otherwise, you are chasing a shiny object. It's cute, it's great, you're doing it, but you are not getting, you will get incremental, but you're not getting that final value.
Right. And you don't get those doctors on board, then
Yes,
you're going to be in
important.
trouble. So, okay, so we'll turn to questions now. I want to start, the gentleman at the back there who asked the question at the beginning, did we answer your question to your satisfaction, or would you like to ask again? Please.
The narrative was excellent, by the way, and the speakers also filled that narrative quite nicely. Thanks for coming back to me, I appreciate it. I almost gave up, but so that was great. But I think perhaps just me, but the connection between all the innovation stuff you talked about and the title of this conversation, which was the smarter enterprise. I didn't jump to the conclusion. Sure, innovation is important, but because an organization's investing and you're doing a lot of innovation, whether it's IT or what you all call digital, right, or not, right? Innovation is important, but is that really what makes them smarter? Some folks touched on parts of it. Like, for example, a smarter enterprise. Although you said it, the fellow from Deloitte said it, perhaps negative connotation where other companies might poach your talent and so on. I think they're the smarter enterprise because they're poaching talent. Right? The individual on the left, I think from Salesforce also said something like, well, they've got people in the organization, most of 80% organization, they don't get digital, they've been there hundreds of years. Well, but they know what you do. Right? So perhaps the smarter enterprise gets the right talent and or utilizes the assets they already have, and they get the collective intelligence, right, to generate ideas, digital or not. And think about the Shark Tank concept, right? You have contests, and those people that have been here 150 years, I bet you if you're on a Shark Tank, and I know this works because we did it with a very, very large and stoic and glacial moving government agency, which you all know I'm talking about, right? But we ran a Shark Tank thing, and we fixed a major problem that was in the news recently, in the last couple of years, from patient visits taking months or years down to weeks. Because some of those people that had been there for 200 years, right, because they had cobwebs on, they came up with some really cool ideas on how to fix the problem. And they implemented them, right, the execution, from idea to execution. So maybe talk about innovation of how you quickly move and close the gap between idea or ambition and execution.
Well, I think that's an interesting one, and having been in the government space before I joined Deloitte, how you enable that, right? So there was a big problem, right? So somebody threw out the issue, and then you allowed the talent to actually present the ideas, you curated it, and then you actually implemented it, so it didn't just fall on deaf ears. And so that's a virtuous cycle that you'd love to have.
To implement it because it came from the same people who have to do the implementation.
Yeah.
So if that idea probably came from the secretary of XYZ and said, this is what we're going to do, I bet you $1, and I got 50 cents in here, so I'm at risk. Right? But I bet you it wouldn't have gotten done if it got shot down because of the tribal whatever resistance to change. But because the people came up with the idea, and they're the ones that were empowered to make it happen through multidisciplinary teams, which Lilly CIO mentioned, right? That was cool. So again, sorry to have you hop off. I love this talk. It was great. But
So let me throw one more piece of data towards that, and then I want to make sure we get in one more question here as well. But it is interesting to ask the question. So I didn't have time to show you anywhere near all the things we got in the survey. But one of the things we asked is how are these different innovation sources evolving in their importance? And one of the things we see is that these business unit staff, which are really the ones who have this kind of deep expertise you're talking about, who've been there for a long time, there's a remarkable drop in how much these companies are saying that is one of their 3 most important sources of innovation. It is falling dramatically. So it seems to be people moving away from the sort of like, you've been working on it for a long time and you do it, because that's, what we hear anecdotally is because that ends up being more, it becomes implementable, but more incremental. And if you want to get more disruption, you want more transformative, people push it towards a central R&D lab that is a little bit less constrained by the organization. So very interesting that there is this change, but that's what we're seeing. Okay, let me throw out just a last question here that we had on the Slido. So it says, the pharmaceutical industry is generally risk-averse or process-driven. How do you instill a sense of risk-taking when it comes to that innovation?
Yeah. Risk-averse means we are a very regulated industry and should be, right? By the nature of it, there are certain risks we absolutely cannot take because at the end of the day, it's about the safety of the patients and all that stuff. But how do you bring that culture of risk-taking and tolerable risk-taking, right? Whether you call it intelligent risk-taking. And that's where this whole concept of fail faster. So we kind of, especially when you're in the hypothesis generation phase, right? That's where you can kind of generate several hypotheses, test hypotheses. You can kind of, based on data, make the decisions. And that's where we are saying that how fast can we do that? What's the risk tolerance over there? We need to move faster in that phase. And then we have critical success factors at every stage to say, okay, if we meet this, then we move forward. And that's how we are doing it. Some of the other things, even the gentleman saying that people having deep experience and expertise, you have 3-4 generations in the workplace. So it's that deep know-how is very, very important, along with what you bring from the outside together, creating new ideas. And as I said, especially in research, we are creating these small, nimble teams, and that allows them to take certain risks, but there is nimble governance also on there, and that's how we are trying to change the paradigm. There's also a dialogue with the regulators that are going on, so we can move as fast as the science takes us, and as fast as we have the regulatory acceptance. And you have seen strides recently, especially with the US FDA, as to how they are involved in the dialogue, accepting of some of the new innovations that are coming through, and it is really very nice to see that.
Excellent. Well, Brian, Aarti, Doug, thank you very much. We appreciate it.